Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Biz Dev Podcast, the podcast about developing your business. I'm David Baxter, your host, and I'm joined, as always, by Gary Voigt, who is a member of the Tall Hat Club. I had this funny visual that underneath your hat, your forehead is actually that big.
Like Beavis and Butthead? It just sticks
It's like,
way
yeah,
above
like
it.
a cone head from the old Saturday Night.
Not close.
Not close, yeah. He just wanted
It's
to show
just
off
the
his hair
angle
again.
of the camera. Yeah.
It's quite a hat. Did they come in small, medium, and large, or you just went for the
My
top
head
hat
just
variety?
comes in small. So
Nice. Very nice. More
all hats are
importantly,
large.
when you have a tiny little micro head, I shouldn't say anything. I have a melon head. So, yeah. We are joined by Rich Edwards, who is the CEO at Mindspan Systems. How are you doing?
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So you are, let me make sure I understand this, because I'm interested in particular. Mindspan focuses on community banks. What does that mean? I'm not a banker. I have a bank. That's as far as I get. So tell me about community banking. What does that mean?
Sure. So the simplest version is small, but the technical definition gets into credit unions and chartered banks that have less than $10 billion in assets. And there's some market factors that kind of get into why that's a clip, but it's mainly regulatory. Things you have to do become way harder and more difficult. It's not that there aren't public companies below that, but the regulatory hurdles and the things you have to do above that become much harder and much more difficult. So you're either below that or you're way above it, right? That kind of becomes this like culling line for the whole thing. And so on the smaller side is colloquially referred to as community financial institutions, would cover all of those companies like that.
So I know the little I know about banking is that there's tons and tons of acquisitions that happen. Mm-hmm. And is that, so, I mean, how do you go from a community bank, or is there a lot of acquisitions to stay right at that $10 billion range? Or is it, boom, now I'm in the stratosphere. I got bought by one of the big boys.
It's usually smaller companies coming together, trying to like corner part of the market or have a footprint in another state, for example. But yeah, no, lots of that has been for the past 20 years and a little bit more, but the trend, right? Very, very infrequent. You see a brand new bank or what's called a de novo bank. That doesn't happen very often. In fact, you get a lot of press about it when it does, because it's like a weird thing that happens. It is usually a combination of these smaller banks kind of becoming larger community banks or larger credit unions, or sometimes credit unions buying banks, which is a controversial thing. But
that's a question I had. What is the difference between a community bank and a credit union? I just assumed, like in the area that I live, credit unions are smaller and community banks are smaller. So are they closely related, or is it just a difference in the way they do business?
Yeah, it's not size, because there are some monster credit unions. Navy Federal, I believe, is the largest one in the country, and they are well past that 10 billion mark. Okay. And there are smaller registered banks, like well below 100 million. You'll see in there as well, right? So it's kind of a gamut. It's the business model and the charter, right? How they're allowed to operate from a regulatory standpoint. The main difference between them is credit unions are nonprofits, and they're organized to serve a specific community or a specific charter. Now, sometimes that's a zip code charter. Sometimes it's a specific class of consumer, like employees. So you'll see a lot of credit unions that are like credit union for the employees of such and such company, or such
veterans
federal
specifically.
Correct. Things like that, right?
Okay.
That they have a defined charter that says this is the market that you're allowed to serve. Now, the controversial part comes in there is banks are happy to have credit unions serve smaller communities, slices of the market that they can or don't want to touch. But when they get larger and become more competitive with banks, very clearly they have a cost benefit, because they're nonprofits, right? They don't have a tax line in what they're doing, and that gives them a cost advantage. And so a lot of times that's why you see credit unions are able to offer advantageous rates on mortgages, car loans, personal loans, et cetera, right? And that's tied into it. And so there's always this tension back and forth between them on that level.
So you are the CEO of Mindspan.
Mm-hmm.
Are you the founder?
No, Mindspan has existed, I think was originally founded in 2003.
Okay.
And I bought Mindspan in 2018.
Okay.
And I did it in like kind of a career transition where, you know, I was ready to kind of go do something else and kind of had a thesis about what I wanted to do and was looking for an organization that had a very specific background and skill set and experience in a certain part of the market. And Mindspan very much fit the bill. And I was kind of fortunate after a rather lengthy search to, you know, find somebody who was about the right size and the founder was ready to move on.
So I heard an interesting phrase. I don't know if the right term for it. It was an interesting concept that I heard on YouTube. And again, I can never remember who the person is, but he's a really buff guy and he gives financial advice. And I found him to be really interesting. He mentioned, and I'm not even sure if this is his idea, but I'm going to give him credit for it. Alex something. Anyway.
Stone Cold Hard Cash, Steve Austin.
No, stop it. Back off. This is why you're not allowed to talk, Gary. He mentioned that there were three kinds of people. There is the artist, people who start businesses, run businesses. There's the artist, there's the hybrid, and there's the entrepreneur. And the artist is someone like me who was good at a thing and decided to start a business to do the thing. And they love the thing and they wanted to hire and grow around that. In my case, it's custom development, but it could be anything that you're passionate about. The entrepreneur is someone whose thing, the thing that they love, is business itself. They don't care what they're running. They just want to run a business. And a hybrid, of course, is a mix of the two. So where would you find yourself? Since you bought this business, you did a search.
Yeah.
You bought this business. This wasn't a passion. You weren't a banker who just decided, yeah, I'm going to help banks. You decided to buy this business. What was that process for you?
Well, so a little bit about my background. I started my career, I was an engineer. My undergraduate degree is in engineering. And I actually went to school on a ROTC scholarship and was an engineer officer in the Army. Now, this was the 90s, so it was a totally different deal. It was long before 9/11, and I was gone by the time 9/11 happened. So my experience totally different than the experience of everybody else from the past 2 decades. But when I got out, I worked in manufacturing for a little bit, worked for Alcatel in the communications market. I was working in fiber optic cable industry. And it was very much like operations focused, very similar to kind of what I had done as an engineer, as an Army officer, you know, very much like frontline leadership type stuff, you know, that like blocking and tackling aspect of things. And I wanted to get into business management and particularly on the market side. And I ended up going back to school, got my MBA at Carolina here in Chapel Hill. And, you know, that was a big, you know, kind of career shift. And that got me into a marketing position at IBM. And kind of along the way, I got into the software business over there. And I really didn't have a background in software business, but did a lot of work from a market analyst standpoint and ended up eventually into a business that in product management that focused on banking, financial services, large government operations, data center automation, things like that, you know, making things run and work, and then getting into the business requirements of that. So I was never a developer. I didn't do anything like that, but got really into understanding business requirements, helping translate that into technical requirements, and then turning it into a finished product, right? Like that whole process. And that really kind of set the hook for the whole idea of, you know, what do you want to be able to go do? But, you know, really went deep in that as a like a domain of understanding. And then on the industry side, it just by happen chance, it turned out to be banking and financial services. And, you know, I was making the rounds with all the Wall Street banks and, you know, every big banking center in the world to kind of talk to clients about what they needed to do, particularly kind of post recession, you know, 08, 10, when the regulatory requirements on banks were getting ratcheted up and there was a whole lot of new things that they had to do. Plus there was this massive consolidation that was going on. And these turned into like difficult technical problems, right, that we were kind of helping them solve. So that was like an exciting experience to be involved in that. And then not because of anything that, I could do other than knowing how the machine of offerings work in IBM, I got tapped to go work at what would become the Watson business unit, work in artificial intelligence. And the part that we were building, it had existed for a while. Obviously, there was like the Jeopardy work. There was the things that were being done in knowledge management around healthcare and cancer research, the stuff that was in the commercials at the time. And they were looking to build basically like an API driven platform so that customers could build on top of the technology, could build things themselves, right? And use the incredible level of resources that were basically sitting in IBM research, largely geared around natural language processing. That wasn't the only thing, but that was certainly where the major focus was, and make that available, via a platform that customers could use. And today that's kind of like, oh yeah, well, everybody does that. Well, back in 2013, other than some of the speech to text work that Google was doing around the Android ecosystem, none of that really existed. It wasn't really flushed out. And so we were kind of early to that and brought that together. And so, I got about 3.5, 4 years of drinking from the fire hose on kind of the very leading edge of kind of what AI was at the time and what it was going to be. But mostly it was about working with customers and working with a lot of existing customers and new customers that were thinking about the use cases. How can we really leverage this? How can we change my business model, give me advantage? And because I was the bank guy, because of what I did, I became the guy that, hey, go back to Wall Street, go back to, Canary Wharf in London, go to Zurich, go to all the places where the banking industry is, and go talk to them about this and see what they're interested in, kind of show them what we got. Right. So, I had this team that we kind of called developer evangelism. That was, the outreach for come build on top of our platform. And what are your specific requirements and kind of how can we help you do that? So that was kind of my last 4 years at IBM. And it was great. It was awesome. I really enjoyed it and I learned a lot. But again, that kind of hook had been set around doing my own thing. And, at that point, I'm mid 40s looking at what am I going to do? And it's like, look, you're either going to do this now or you're not. The clock's ticking on this. Now, I know everybody kind of talks about, well, Ray Kroc was in his 50s when he did McDonald's, and was Harlan Sanders was like his 70s when he started, KFC, and, everything that, Winston Churchill for was in his late 60s. But I'm like, yeah, I don't think I'm that kind of like right tail guy that's going to like pull that out in my last 5 years. So it was like now or never. Now's the time to do it. And so that's what kind of started me down the path of, in my case, my kind of investment thesis. That makes it sound smarter than it was. But what I was looking for was really somebody, an organization that had experience working with customers in regulated industries where data handling was difficult and it was expensive, but it was also very valuable. And they were kind of willing to put the effort and the time and bring in experts to help them with that. And so that was really where Mindspan came in. And, most of where their business was in financial services, banking, and healthcare. And that's really where most of our business is today. Now, I have found, based on my background and who I am, it is difficult for me to make a compelling case that we could really grow a big business in healthcare. We kind of work with some partners and certainly have some interesting things there, but really I can tell a much more interesting story on the finance and banking side. So we've kind of shifted towards that from a growth standpoint and how we position ourselves today.
So, anecdote here. Let's see, probably it was late 2014, early 2015, somewhere in that range. I used Watson for one of our clients early days. Mm-hmm. And we used you guys, we built on your platform. It was a client, they're defunct now, so there's no NDA broken here. but they defunct a long time ago, actually. They had some connection with you guys at IBM at the time and wanted to embrace AI. And so we ended up using your dialogue tree thing. And that was intense. But it's interesting how that you're right in that same time frame where we were, and it was still pretty squishy at the time when we were doing it. It was still, you guys were still hammering out like the docs and the APIs and stuff. It was pretty. It was a moving target, as it were. I'm curious though, what your thoughts, since you do have that experience. How is IBM feeling now that AI has exploded and yet they were one of the early birds?
I think, again, this is Rich Edwards' opinion, right?
Not sure, based on anything else. An IBM employee.
Right. Yes. My personal opinion is I think they missed a huge opportunity. And that was largely on really wanting to be a services business, right? Which is where the vast majority of revenue was coming from, not necessarily profit, but revenue, and being less interested in being a product or a software driven business. And where things headed and how they focused, they made some amazing investments, and there were some really great things there, but it seemed to be played as second fiddle to the services side. It was very much like, how can we use this to get more services revenue, which, being a software guy, right, it would drive you crazy, because you're sitting on a gold mine and you're leveraging it to kind of go after like a trucking business on the side, right? I mean, that's very derogatory to the services business, and not certainly what I mean.
Sure, I understand.
But it seemed, from my perspective, it seemed like a missed opportunity. And I think if you look at how they position now, I think they're kind of sticking with that play. Arvind Krishna, the CEO now, I mean, he ran what was then called information management business, which was basically like the database business. And that was kind of where he cut his teeth as a general manager and kind of positioned himself in the line of succession behind Ginni Rometty. And a lot of things that he does. So he knows, he has the background from that standpoint, and is, I think he's kind of playing the hand that he's dealt from that standpoint. So
it's interesting because I think Google very well could have done the same thing, not necessarily the service angle, but they were sitting. I mean, like we've said before, like a million people have said before, the T in ChatGPT was invented by Google.
Exactly.
They've been in the thick of it for a long time. And yet they were so afraid to make a product that might upset their money train that they did not have any plans to do so until Microsoft, in their famous words, made them dance. And I am curious if in 5 or 10 years, if Microsoft is going to look back like the Japanese in World War II, waking the sleeping giant. Because Google is very good at this. And now they are incentivized, because Microsoft is coming for them hard. They're incentivized to now make a product on stuff that they truly, truly know. And it wouldn't surprise me, because of that kick in the pants, if in 5 or 10 years, it's still Google in charge. And Microsoft is like, man, this is the angry little guy in the back who's so close, so close. We'll see. I could be totally and completely wrong. But it's really interesting.
Yeah, I remember reading, it might have been a podcast or it was an article I was reading, and they were talking about like, hey, top 10 companies today, how many of them were top 10 20 years ago? Only one, and it was Microsoft.
Yeah, Microsoft's the only one who's been around.
Correct. And now, granted, it is a completely different Microsoft than it was 20 years ago, and they have demonstrated their ability to, even having missed mobile effectively completely. And to a certain extent been late to the game with cloud, they're still there, right? They've still managed to kind of, pivot and move around what they're doing, and, take up a new direction to stay relevant at that scale globally. I mean,
yeah, kudos.
Boy,
to them,
I mean, bet against that, right?
Yeah, they are probably, 20 years ago, Google was super, what year? 2003. So they were just coming of age. Right. Microsoft had been dominating for 15 years by that point. Apple was just getting warmed up from almost going bankrupt.
They had a market cap of, I think, about 50 or 60 billion, and they're 2.8 today, right? It's about almost a 500x. It's like.
Well, and the crazy thing is one of those things that got lost in history. The only reason there's a Apple at all right now is because Microsoft saved their bacon. Mm-hmm. They gave them a mountain of money to keep them solvent because Bill Gates didn't want to be the only one on the planet. So he wanted a competitor. And so people forget that all the time, especially Apple nerds like Gary down there, who forget that Microsoft is the only reason Apple exists. It's important to remember that, Gary. a good $1 trillion at least to Microsoft. Yeah. Well, what's interesting is for a long time, and I'm sure this has ended a while ago, but for a long time, a big part of Microsoft's profit line was additions to Apple stock because they owned so much of the company. Mm-hmm. They were non-voting shares or anything like that, but they had a ton of stock. And as Apple went through the stratosphere, Microsoft is making bank. And it was such an interesting thing to see these two. I mean, these guys have been rivals forever.
Sure.
And now I'm sure at this point, and I don't know this, I would assume they've sold that by now, but I don't know, maybe not. Anyway,
they also had a pretty good CEO during that time as well.
Sure. I mean, it was titans of industry for sure. Yeah. Well, I guess we're in another age of a titans, but they're still here.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. Tech CEOs are now still striving to be the next Steve Jobs, and it's just not going to happen. They don't have the charisma.
But like, here's the thing, Steve Jobs, right? Like he was the next Edwin Land, right? It wasn't like he kind of came out of nowhere and everything was unique. He went back and looked at what Polaroid had done, kind of in post-World War II. And in fact, I think there's a story about him actually meeting Edwin Land, like in the late 70s when he started Apple, and like having an actual personal connection with him. But you look at the playbook, man, everybody stands on the shoulders of giants, right?
Oh, for sure.
It's do you pick the right giants to stand on, right? So.
Yeah. If you pick the wrong one, you look like a moron. And it's I mean, Steve Jobs, I debate Gary all the time. I've read his biography. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I would ever consider Steve Jobs a charismatic individual. Certainly a genius, but not a lot of people liked him, which is usually what you would consider charisma. But
yeah, maybe charisma is not the right word. I'll just say he had a gravity around him.
For sure.
And certainly the ability to like extract exceptionally good work out of people, whether they liked him or not, right? His ability to paint a vision and drag people along and have the discipline organizationally to like say no to all the things they said to, his ability to rationalize their portfolio, like amazing.
I think one of the things said most about his reason for success is his ability to say no and just like, nope, that's not enough. Not what I wanted. I don't care how many people you say are going to like this. I'm going to say that are going to like this version better and just keep going. And yeah, it turns out he was right. I wouldn't say more often he was wrong, but he was right enough to make that kind of his legacy for it.
Mm-hmm. When I think of leadership though, I want to care about my people. I want to get in the trenches with them. I want them to know that I care. I want them to build a good product because they believe in what we're doing, not because they're afraid of me.
But I think there's certainly a lot of lessons and things you can kind of take away from anybody, right?
Fair.
It's not all or nothing. It's not like in order to be a design genius, you have to be a jerk to everyone, right? No, absolutely not. The person is not the whole, right? There's plenty of things that they're going to be 10 out of 10, 11 out of 10, 12 out of 10 on, right?
I like the idea of talking leadership in general, because I think all the people listening to us, all the small business owners who are striving to build something great, they have to build something great. Again, stand on someone's shoulders. And who you choose to stand on, I think matters. And I think a lot of people look at Steve Jobs and they're like, man, yeah, that's great. Or they look at Gary Vee, who, now he's rebranded himself, but for a long time he was hustle, 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 right? Work until you die, blah, blah, blah. And now he's about kindness and feel good. I don't know if that happens after you're a certain level of success and you can let that off the gas. I don't know. But I think it's important to find out who you want to model yourself after and then do that. But do your research, right? It's really easy to follow some of these guys, especially in the social media age, and to think, oh, he has all the answers, I'm going to follow this person, and find out they're really big jerks. Just, I don't know. So, okay, we will loop it back to you. So you start, or not start, you buy Mindspring.
Yep.
And so tell me a bit more about what you guys do for the community banks. Are you a software platform? Or are you a services platform? What do you guys do?
Yeah, we're services. We have a few software assets that we'll bring to bear, but we're primarily a services company.
Okay.
And really, what we do is we help the companies we work with make their first party data a productive asset. It's, let's turn this into something that you're actually going to use. And particularly in like I said, in a regulated industry, when you say things like governance around data, they will automatically put that in the vein of like risk and compliance, which means lock it down, never touch it. It's a third rail. It's a liability. In fact, like the fact that we have information about our customers, this is something we can be sued over. So therefore, never use it, never make it available, lock it down, keep it siloed in 12 different organizations, 12 different places, the whole thing. Never put it in a cloud data warehouse, anything like that. And the problem is that's fine, but all you're doing is preventing downside. You have like no upside that you're able to do with that. And not just upside from like a financial standpoint, but upside from like, how much better can you serve your customers? How much more relevant can you be when you're showing up with the right offer at the right time in the right language, being there for your customers when you need them, regardless of what the domain or industry is, right? Being able to do that, like bringing that connection together, that is a competitive advantage. And then when you look at it from the financial services and banking standpoint, it's even more so when you're competing against a much larger institution that is almost at industrial scales for what they do. Their ability to talk one-on-one with their customers is incredibly hampered just by their size, just by their level of kind of process overhead that they have. They're at a disadvantage. And so for a smaller, more nimble organization, if they can do that and do a better job and really bring what they're really good at, a community bank, is the in-branch experience. You go into the bank, it is somebody who is your neighbor, who understands you, right? And that's just not like a one-on-one thing. It's also their understanding of the market. That's why you see community banks are like way over indexed from small business financing. So small business association lending programs, commercial real estate, and agricultural banking, right? Those three areas, they punch like 2x above their weight class when you like look at it as like a percentage of assets, et cetera, right? And it's because they're tied into that local community. They have that intelligence, that understanding of what that local market is, to be able to engage with customers, and they wouldn't say this, but take bets that larger banks and institutions won't, because they're painting a much broader swath, like across the country, right? That doesn't have the ability to kind of allow for variances at the local market level. So that aspect of it, like their ability to do that, that's their magic. That's why, institutions of this size have been around more than 100 years, because they're able to do that. The problem is, and this has become more acute in the past 10, 15 years, is that personal experience begins to fade away the second you walk out the door. The digital channels they have, like through their extended partners, through ATM networks, like all the different ways that you might touch the bank or their services or how they help you, the further you are away from that like in-person experience, the less personal it gets, the less that magic kind of works into the experience. And frankly, that's an opportunity for them. And it's not necessarily a technological one. There's certainly elements of that, but we're kind of well past the point where every community bank has a functional mobile app that they use, and it has most, if not all, of the capability it needs. It's their ability to really kind of orchestrate the experience, be able to, again, show up at the right time with the right offering, in the right language, in the right way, that's going to solve a problem for their customer, right? In branch, nail it. Like 9 times out of 10, they're great, right? Not always, but can really, really do well. And again, punch above their weight class. Digital experience, less so. And what they're seeing is, to a certain extent, millennials, very much for Gen Z, they're almost a non-player. And when you look at their market penetration, Gen X and older still doing very well, high loyalty. You look at the past 3 to 4 months of like asset flight that has gone out of smaller banks to like larger institutions because people are scared about the security of their money. Community banks way overperformed, did much better. Like just a demonstrable value of the trust level that their customers have in them. Way better than like any other size of business.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like a warmer experience when you can actually you know the guy and it's just right there. It's not just a big corporate entity that's sending you emails every now and then.
Who says I'm not allowed to help you, or I can't help you, or I have to read off this script for this thing that we're doing, right? Yeah. Which is infuriating a lot of times.
So I think one thing that you're saying that I think isn't, what's the right word, is not given enough credit is that locality in small business. Because I think a lot of places are kind of shy about that because that means I'm small. And if I'm small, that means I'm not as good. That's the mentality. But I think a lot of small businesses could really lean into that and figure out ways that smallness, localness, can be a real advantage versus, oh, well, I'm not LL Bean, but I'm selling shirts, right? Well, okay, but you can sell very specific shirts. I'm seeing, I don't know if this is a thing here, but Durham, which I know is where you are, there is something about that town. Everybody loves Durham. There are T-shirts that say Durham on it. And there aren't a lot of cities that can pull that off. I don't have a single one that says Wake Forest, right? That's just not a thing that anybody can. And you don't really even see them. I mean, it's not even a size thing because Raleigh doesn't have them either. I think Dallas does, but Dallas is weird. But
yeah. Well, they didn't make a movie about your baseball team. So, there's that.
That's fair. That's true. But it's what I think is interesting is a lot of local businesses have been popping up to sell Durham specific clothing because they realize they're tapping into that passion that people who live there really have for the town. And it is becoming like, this is the ultimate hyper local market. Yeah. And thanks for stealing my thunder there, Gary. Appreciate that. And it's just really interesting. I mean, and I think that's something that small businesses, while they're small, I mean, eventually maybe you do get bigger, but while you're small, embrace that localness. And I think it's advantageous.
Yeah. Proximity to customers, right? Your closeness to them, your ability to react to them, the level of kind of genuine interaction you have with them, the bigger that you get, the more layers you have, the weaker that becomes, right? And that is just the natural elements of becoming a larger organization. It's a rarity that you see somebody that's able to kind of overcome that. And yeah, that's a thing. That is very much a thing. And something, when you look at it from SWOT analysis or anything where you're trying to figure out what are my really strengths, where can I stand out and be differentiated in the market? Man, that is a big one right there. And, you start thinking about your strategy and the investments I'm going to make, how can I take that element of my business and turn it up to 11 and just be so far beyond what any other option, what any alternative the customer might have. Yeah, huge advantage. And that's really where a lot of, competitive moats come from as well.
I got a question. Since we're giving advice, what would you say are your top 3 pieces of advice for an entrepreneur, small business, local business, new business starting up based on your experience? Plus you have a background in the operational side of things. So you might have an advantage there. If for someone, a lot of times small business owners they'll go right in and not have an operational plan. They kind of filter that back in once things are moving and then try to retrofit it. So if you have any upfront advice about getting your operations and your processes in order first.
I think one of the best pieces of advice I got, particularly kind of being a first-time CEO, was a friend of mine who I think he's 3 or 4 times into it at this point. And I had actually connected with him. His company had been acquired by IBM, and we kind of worked together, and then he went off and did 2 more. I remember he told me once, he said, Rich, he says, you have to be the leader or the CEO that your organization needs, not the one that you want. And he went on to tell me about his second company where, he was like me, because we connected over this. He was like a product management guy, product strategy, under the customer, all of those things. He goes into this company's and like all of the problems that he had to deal with that were on fire that he needed to do to get them to the next level had nothing to do with product. It was all these like other weird things, stuff about insurance and like how they were going to get people paid and like all these like organizational things. And he says, so I had to like lean into that. I had to be that guy for the organization during that phase of our growth, even though that's not what I wanted to do. You take on that job as leader, right? I mean, it is, the buck stops with you. You got to get it done. So it's either you're going to find the right people to delegate this to, or you're going to clear the way so that the people that are working for you work on the thing that, they're 10X on, that's really about their skills, and kind of clear away everything else. Right. And that kind of becomes your job. So, having that, I guess humility might be the right word, or at least self-awareness to understand, starting something new, you got to get your hands dirty, and you're going to have to do stuff that nothing about, you've never done before. And you're going to have to be the one that figures out how to be the expert on it, or figure out enough that you're qualified to, hire somebody or bring somebody in to kind of do it for you, but you're smart enough to know I'm an educated buyer in this space. Right. Which, the older you get, the worse you are at being a college freshman. Right. So, that's a pretty big barrier, and it can be a drain, but that's something you're signing up for. I think I got to come up with 3, right? You said so.
You don't have to.
Okay, all right.
3 is just kind of what we throw out there.
I'll dovetail one more on this, right?
Okay.
Kind of that idea of like clearing the way for others, right? A lot of times, and I've seen this several times in my career, the whole Peter principle thing, like somebody gets promoted to manager for the first time, it's because they were a really good individual contributor. Like they knew their job functioned really well. And it's like, well, now you're in charge of everybody, right? You can kind of shepherd them and lead them and coach them. And there's some elements to that. And like team lead positions do really well, but there's a mindset switch that you have to go through to say, like, it is no longer my job to be the contributor. Like my value is not what I do personally. It's what I enable everybody around me to do. All of the ways in which I'm able to set them up for success by creating the right environment, by eliminating the barriers, by getting rid of like the dumb things that are like holding them back, whether that's politics within the organization or dealing with clients or some of the like administrative stuff on the back end. All of the ways that you kind of engineer that to get the most out of your people, that your scorecard becomes how well they do, not what you do. And that's a very much a big shift to be a successful manager. And it's an even bigger shift, when you're running the whole show and it becomes, multidisciplinary, and there's all these areas that frankly you have no background in.
Yeah. David, I'm going to quote David to David. One of David's famous sayings on this show is, your job as CEO is to give away your job. Meaning that if you start the company as a tacticianer, eventually as you grow, you have to give that up. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it kind of
just not easy.
Mimics, or I should say mirrors kind of the second piece of advice that you gave. Well, if anybody else wants to learn more about your company, Mindspan, and what you guys do, what is the best way to get in touch with you or just find you online?
Yeah, I'm most active on LinkedIn and Twitter. And I'm Rich Edwards on both platforms. So, LinkedIn /Rich Edwards or Twitter /Rich Edwards. Our company, Mindspan Systems, it's Mindspan Systems Inc. Mindspaninc.com. We own a couple of domains.
Okay. We'll add those links to the show
Sure.
notes too for anybody to just click on them. And if anybody has any comments or questions for us, you can email us at hello@thebigpixel.net, or you can leave comments below this video or get in touch with us on any one of our social media platforms.
Gary also accepts pigeons to his house.
Carrier pigeons, not just regular
Carrier pigeons to the trailer. Flamingos, actually.
Crows, I
flamingos to
prefer
the
crows and ravens, but pigeons, yeah, they're good too.
Rats in the sky. All right. Thank you so much, Rich, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate it.
And thank you for siding with me on the Steve Jobs is better than Bill Gates issue. All right. And that's all for this week. We'll see you guys next time.
It's a good thing you're cutting me off. See ya.